Thank you very much, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here and being joined by my amazing panel. I would like to call up to the stage Ashim, who is the managing partner at Octera Capital, a Pan African early stage investor in the tech and alternative assets. All right, let's give a big hand for Ashim. Alice, I think you were not supposed to leave the stage. You were just supposed to. I don't need to run another introduction again. Thank you so much. And I am surrounded by, so I'm surrounded by roses, and I'm the thorn amongst the roses today. So that's amazing. Let me call up another amazing lady to join us. Demi, if you are in the room, I want to give you a big introduction. So please welcome Miss Demi Thompson. Demi runs a company called Diligence Africa, which provides due diligence solutions to investors covering financial, commercial, and technology sector. Right. I think. Right. Is Ben in the room? Oh yes, there's Ben. Ben, please come through. Yes. Ben, I only saw. Yeah. I was looking for you all along, so I'm going to give you the honors. Please,
No,
Ben.
no.
At least now I'm not alone. I'm with two thorns amongst roses. So we can. Ben, please do introduce yourself as we get started. So at least I don't have to speak alone. So do go ahead, Ben.
Okay. Well, I was very polite. I was waiting for you to sort of, welcome me on stage, and so I'm Ben. I'm one of the founders and partner at Briga. Briga is a European and now African fund. We manage north of $700 million these days, and we, are a team of founders and operators backing early stage companies on the continent for the last 12 months now, I think, with a team on the ground in Lagos and here in South Africa as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we're going to dive straight into it for those that are just joining in. So the topic is building bridges between international ecosystems and Africa. So we want to really unpack what does that look like for startups, what does that look like for scale-ups, even at organizational, institutional, or policy perspective, what does that look like? So just to set the scene, I think I'll start with you, Alice, right? Just to set the scene. Maybe if you can just, from also even your experience at SeedStars, looking at market entry barriers and type of solutions that we can provide, what would you say are the significant barriers that startups face when they are looking at getting into markets across borders?
I think it's the same problem everywhere, so it's not necessarily an African problem. What we see, it's very linked to like regulation just coming in, but also many entrepreneurs kind of underestimate the cost and the time it takes to enter a new market. And so we find them like having these really great analysis, making those macro assumptions, and then or facilitating because there's one great talent or one great entry point with a consumer, and then they realize that the hurdles to overcome kind of the consumer habits or understanding the relevance of their product or how much they have to pivot to suit the new market makes it much more difficult. But we see it with our Asian investments like in MENA, like in LATAM. What's really interesting to see, because we have a global thesis with one of our early stage funds, is that we push for them to have a lot of peer-to-peer engagement. So they really work as kind of a global founder community. And we're seeing so many ways for them to collaborate. So a South African entrepreneur that sees, as I was mentioning before, Filipino was the right market because it actually had much more similarities to the neighboring countries. Or we invested in a B2B commerce in Pakistan, and they had done a really interesting deal with a European firm. And because there was no direct competition with their Senegalese kind of immediate, which was a similar business model, they were able to secure the same deal for that Senegalese founder. So it's actually very interesting to see how there is much more cross-border collaboration between the founders. And then I think investors, we see the same thing. We're a very international group. Many of the follow-on funding comes from overseas, still very much the US and Europe, so quite positive.
I like you mentioned that you have a global thesis and you sort of take a per region approach, not to have a blanket approach to say this is the playbook on how to commercialize. It's a case by case. You're looking at insights, what is driving that market, and then you tailor it according to that. Quite interesting. Quite interesting. I'm going to ping it to you, Ashim, and just building on that tone that Alice has just set. And my question to you would be, beyond capital, what specific capabilities and resources should international ecosystem players provide to help African startups to build truly global companies?
Thanks, Tendai. I think really important questions.
Yeah.
At Octera Capital, we believe that the check is the smallest part of what we bring to the table. So beyond capital, in fact, is actually a really important consideration. So first of all, I don't think African startups need help. So they don't need help doing anything, right? Typically, entrepreneurs don't need help. Maybe they need guidance, maybe they need all sorts of things, but help is probably not what they need. But beyond capital, we would say that there is value in having international investors on board, just like there's value in having local investors on board. The international investors can bring a completely different bucket, I suppose, of flowers, since we're on that topic, to the table. So if we think about, okay, well, you know, what are the networks that they can tap into that potentially local investors can tap into, that the entrepreneurs don't have access to? These could be fellow portfolio companies, right? Alice made some examples there where there's oftentimes connections between founders across geographic regions, so that could be really interesting. But also generally like strategic partnerships, right? Where you say, okay, well, I've got a different pool of LPs in my fund than SeedStars has in their fund, so therefore, if SeedStars can tap into what their sort of global network looks like, that can be of, you know, incredible importance to the entrepreneurs as they grow, as they scale, especially as they scale across regions. But I think most importantly, it's really around understanding, you know, the value of the partnerships between the local and the global investment ecosystems, right? And understanding that we all bring something else to the table, right? So when Ben and I look at a deal, we'll very much understand that there's a value that I add and there's a value that he adds, and that value may look very different, but therein lies the magic, and that's how we can then really ensure, you know, that we, you know, sort of bring out the best for each of the startups that we're then co-investing in.
Awesome. So essentially, it takes a village. Right. So there are no silos even amongst funders. So it goes beyond the capital. We create a whole village ecosystem. Now in Africa, we say it takes a village to raise a child. So it also takes a village to raise a startup. So if we are putting it on a map and we are pinning nuggets, so there's a global thesis that we have, Alice, that you just shared, that where we need to look at the nuances of the different market that you want to get into, and then what can we leverage on that particular market. And then from what you're saying, Ashim, is that we need to then look at the broader ecosystem on the shared value we can bring beyond just the capital. Right, amazing. So FYI, we are building a playbook. The copyrights are available to everyone. It's an open book. So you're getting the nuggets of how do you globalize your business. Free for charge. Hearing it from the experts, right? Ben, I'm going to switch it to you. I think let's let the ladies rest a little bit, and then I'm going to switch it to you. Let's have a man voice also into the perspective. Ben, my question is, if we're now looking at support organization, ecosystem support organization, what role should ecosystem support organizations play in facilitating meaningful cross-border collaborations? And how can they move beyond just the traditional accelerator model and framework?
So the theme of the day is around, you know, building bridges internationally between, you know, from and across and out of Africa. And I think looking at history always helps. You know, there's good examples that things that work and things that don't work. And if you look at the history of tech in the world, you know, probably the first kind of bridge was built between the US, who kind of been leading the tech space for a long time, and Israel. and then London. And I'll go into the two examples before jumping into Africa. I think the Israel model is interesting because you kind of give, that ecosystem the will to build something big, but realizing that your market is small, so you have to expand usually to the US direct. So it's kind of, taking into account the fact that, yes, you have, an unfair advantage going into a bigger market, but you're starting from a very small one. And then London was pretty much on par with, Paris and Berlin at the time, and this access to the US really accelerated everything because you have way more Americans in London than anywhere else in Europe. And therefore, when the time came to build companies locally, you had that pool of resources, human resources, that knew of the VC model and what's expected, and what growth means, and what resources from the startup angle you need, and all of that accelerated London to where it is today. And if it weren't for Brexit, I think London would be the definite capital of tech in Europe. So what do we do with this in Africa now? I think obviously there's a lot to learn about what works and what doesn't work in other places. I think that the incredible chance Africa has as an ecosystem is that a lot of amazing, talented people go and either get educated overseas or work overseas and then can come back with that sort of passion and understanding and knowledge of how to build companies, which is great, I think. And also understanding about the VC model, which is not a cookie cutter for every company. I mean, ultimately, the VC model requires you to build big businesses, and that's hard. I think building big businesses is really hard. It usually requires to go international, and that complexity you can take from others who've done it. So you can build a tremendously efficient and performing ecosystem in Africa, tapping into the ideas of what worked and what didn't work in other places, and trying to get some of that human capital infusion into the way you build your companies. And I think there's nothing better than this. It usually kicks your butt and accelerates you big time if you have people who've done it somehow. Obviously, you want to avoid the people who have been there, done that, because this is different, and we're building something different. But through the learnings of what happened in other places, I think there's a lot of stuff we can either avoid or piggyback on to accelerate the growth of the local ecosystem.
Awesome. So I think you're bringing an interesting perspective to it, that most incubators and accelerators are not benchmarked against any global standard. They are also not benchmarked against any VC model. They are just developing the startups through their own programmatic action that is not informed by any VC insights. So I think from an ESO perspective, if there are any ESOs in the room, your role then in that whole globalization of producing global-ready startups is align your programs to what the VC's appetite and mandate is. Align your programs to what the global trends are, and then bring it into your programmatic action. Okay.
In a way, although VCs don't know everything, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll give Ash the mic. But what we know is that we need to back companies that are going to be big to have the return on capital our LPs are expecting, right? And there's a power law, and we know that half of the portfolio is going to die. That's life. But we need to make a lot of money on the remaining 50%. And to do this, they need to be scalable, ultimately profitable, sizable businesses. This is what we know. The rest, never ask a VC about what you should build because you have no idea, right? But the only thing VCs know is that it needs to be big. That's the answer. That's it.
I just wanted to add to your summation maybe. The ESO very much work together already, I think, with investors. I don't just VCs, but with the angel community, with VCs, with all sorts of other investors out there. So I do believe that alignment is very much already in existence. And whether that is having a whole bunch of investors at their demo days and looking at where's the appetite? Who's it that's really interested in what type of startups? And I think that actually informs the trends oftentimes then. But very much, they're also trend creators, right? So, for instance, they'll say, actually, we've identified a trend, and we're going to build a cohort around this sector. creative economy, because we believe that, you know what, there's actually a lot of opportunity. There may not yet be appetite on the VC side because we haven't figured out how to
It's
do
a
it.
chicken
But
and egg.
sometimes, yes. But so I don't think that the trends are only being informed by, like the ESOs shouldn't just sit and be informed, but actually they are the trend creators oftentimes, you know, looking at, you know, where is opportunity, bringing that out, incubating it, and then accelerating it sometimes, and then bringing it out for us to invest in.
I think a conversation that another day, if we're allowed, that we will have, is we will debate the efficacy of ESO model to produce quality pipeline that VC has an interest in, that we can really dig into and see.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
have a thought on that because we're in ESO also.
All right?
The only way to fund our acceleration programs that were actually building companies for VCs was by backing it by a fund itself. The big problem of the ASO ecosystem is no one is willing to fund just that very specific model. And then we find ourselves that the funders for ESOs are the DFIs, are the foundations, are corporate CSR, like CSR. And they have to focus on more marginalized communities, industries, go more rural. So we're completely going outside the high growth. We're into those very micro entrepreneurs, niches, dynamic. So there's a real split still between ESOs and VCs, which maybe is okay. I'm not saying, but we haven't been able to like funnel the majority of our deal flow to our venture funds through our ESO activity, unfortunately.
And there are so many data points on that. You want to come in there on them?
No, I think, does this sound? No, I just wanted to add that I think one of the things that we've seen also is that sometimes the disconnect between what investors expect and also what sort of comes out, the pipeline that comes out of accelerators. Sometimes when we're doing due diligence, we realize a lot of the portfolio companies or companies that come out of accelerators usually don't meet up to the standards that you would expect from, that investors want, especially with everything that is going on now where investors are looking at more high quality deals, would not just take any sort of, financial statements. But I think that's what we've seen is some disconnect between the type of the expectations that investors will sort of need investing in high quality pipeline versus what actually comes out of accelerators.
Actually, whilst you still have the mic, I'm going to bring this question to you as we round off this particular segment, because you just touched on something that that links to my next question. So my question then to you now, Demi, is from a measuring partnership success perspective, right? How should we measure the success of ecosystem partnerships beyond just the traditional funding raised metric, right? And what indicators show that we are actually building genuine bridges versus temporary connections?
Yeah. So I think, and capital is great, but I think for us, one thing that we've realized that it's not just enough to provide founders with capital. You need to back that up, like you said, beyond capital, with resources, because founders can do so many things with money. But if you're able to provide them with fractional CFO services, governance and compliance services, basically everything that they need to structure their business, because as they grow and expand to new markets, there will be new challenges, there will be new opportunities, there will be new hurdles that they have to face. But if they don't know and if they don't understand what those sort of hurdles and issues are, then they'll spend so much money trying to solve it, and then they go, we don't have any more funding, and then they go to a place where, okay, they have to start fundraising, the business stops, investors are asking them, oh, what have you done the past 1 year? We've been fundraising, but then your revenue line is static. So I think that one thing that we've seen is intentionally, investors, ESOs, intentionally providing additional support beyond capital. I do think capital is critical. There was a panel last week on the ACEs about how women founders have been over-mentored, but not provided, sufficient capital. And I do think that that's a real thing. So I think in addition to providing, capital, it's critical for investors to provide support for expansion. So some of the potential metrics that ESOs could also measure is how many of you are reaching a certain target every year. And what does that look like? How many of you are acquiring new customers? How much are you growing every year? And actively following up with, those companies. The last question was what?
Yeah, I think you already touched on it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. It was the metrics to say, so beyond just looking at funding as a measure of globalization, what else can we look at? And you just touched on that.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
the more successful, sorry, Ashim, I think the more successful companies are, then the more people hear about the portfolio companies. The only reason why YC is so popular is because they go on to raise additional capital. Now, not all the companies that come out of YC are great, but the thing is, they have put some kind of standard, global standard, that everyone sort of aspires to meet to. There's no reason why we shouldn't have an Africa YC. I know Future Africa is trying to do this, but we need more, honestly. There's no reason why for every country on the continent, there shouldn't be more, YCs, supporting startups.
Yeah. You want to come in there?
Very quickly, and
Yeah.
this is back to Alice's point, I think that, ESOs are not only to service VCs' funding appetite, right? So startups that go through an accelerator or through an incubator can sometimes come out for completely different purposes. They service innovation, for instance, right? If we don't have places where startups can go through certain programs, we may not actually have as much innovation or R&D as we have at the moment, right? Where they can ideate, where they can think through, where they have technical and operating, advisors who can really explain to them, hey, how do I build something? How do I go through it? Yes, you may end up coming out with something that is not a typical VC model. But if you're smart about it, you'll find a different investor, with the appetite of what you've built. Or you'll find a government agency who's willing to patent what you have built, right? Or you'll find a university or a foundation who is willing to help you further explore this innovative, solution. So I do believe that there is another path or different metrics beyond just, are the startups VC fundable by local and global investors? But, what else are they actually churning out?
And I think, sorry, Tanda,
Yeah,
and I
sure.
think the
Go for
truth
it.
is, not every company needs to raise money, right? People will back you and people will support you because you are at the level that they think, and honestly, capital follows growth. So the more high quality, the more revenue that you're able to generate as a company, the more investors will look for you and the more investors will find you. So I totally agree, with what you're saying.
No, amazing. As we round off, I wanted to just get our parting thoughts, but I wanted to frame our parting thoughts in this context. If we look at everything that we've discussed, as a future looking forward perspective, maybe I will start from your side, Ben. Looking at the current global trends, what emerging opportunities exist for deeper, meaningful integration between Africa and the rest of the world, right? So that's the first part of the question. What are the opportunities in the emerging trends that are coming? And then the second part of the question is, what are the tangible steps we can immediately take within the value chain of the ecosystem to make those opportunities a reality? So this is your parting shot, a quotable parting shot. No pressure.
No pressure. Okay. The way I look at it is that, the stats today talk about an extra billion African people in the next 30 years. That's basically, to make it simple, 30 million people a year who need housing, health, food, education. And you don't do 30 million, even if you put 30 people per classroom, you don't build 1 million classroom overnight. It's impossible. So it has to be supported by tech somehow. And the rest of the world should be interested in that opportunity, because either very selfishly and be like, fuck, otherwise it will come at me and it will be a disaster, or very selfishly as, great, it's an amazing business opportunity. So either way, I think that's how, to Ashim's point a bit earlier, African founders should get out of the model of, what African has been developed under for the last 50 years. They're not here for grants, they're here to build fucking amazing businesses. And once everyone around the table is playing that game, I'm sure there's an amazing opportunity out there. And there's no reason why they should, look at things differently from a US or a Chinese founder. There is an immense opportunity to solve some of the most basic issues Africa is going to be facing. And it's impossible to solve these problems without tech. Just the maths don't add up. So there's a huge avenue for tech founders to just, run the table and build great businesses. And if they do, money will come. There's no doubt. Why are, Americans getting excited about India? They don't like curry chicken, but, it's just like they do it because they think there's an amazing business opportunity. That's what it is. It's as simple as that.
Awesome. Ashim, you should.
So I think Africa is actually uniquely positioned to really be like the accelerating force globally, really. One, obviously, we've talked about the youth population, but in addition to that, also, let's think about, the problems we're solving. Yes, they're oftentimes foundational, but they can oftentimes also be converted into necessities that are being met in the global north, right? So it's not only that, okay, well, we've got to fix education, but guess what? If I can fix education at scale for these 30 million people being, born every year, then guess what? I am probably more, better positioned to actually go fix education everywhere else in the world as well, because it is not necessarily a uniquely African problem to say, how do we, better educate our people and do that at scale? If you think about Africa also, we don't really have any legacy systems, right? This is how we've been able to leapfrog in mobile money, right? In remittance, where we are far beyond developed than a lot of other players or a lot of other countries. So absolutely there are solutions that you can now today take from Kenya, from Nigeria, from Senegal, and deploy them into Germany or, the US or wherever, because actually they're far more advanced than what you may meet there. So absolutely, I think from a trends perspective, I do see that there will continue to be a duality of, investments coming into Africa, but very much also of, that knowledge and those solutions going into the world and, solving problems that are not only unique to Africa, but actually that can be transferred to the rest of the world.
Amazing, amazing. Alice?
Something
See,
different
you were
Yeah, I was listening.
you were thinking big. Painting a big picture there.
Unfortunately not, I was just listening. But what they said, and maybe looking more where you mentioned, like, at a value chain perspective, what could be done. I think for us, the idea was we couldn't just invest. So if we couldn't just invest, what did the ecosystem need? And if there are not enough businesses, how do you build more entrepreneurs and founders? And then it was like, okay, we need to now do coding and entrepreneurship schools, find alternative models to give them that time and bandwidth to experiment and fail enough. And the joke at SeedStars is we'll be doing nurseries at some point. It just feels like education, like feeding, accelerating that pipeline of founders that can just aggressively fail, learn, so that the innovations come out of Africa for Africa and for the rest of the world. So that's kind of our thought process. It's a long and painful one, but it never made sense, like many scale-up companies, to just focus on one part of the value chain. And I think many organizations are thinking similar. So education for me is the key ingredient, and if we don't see it coming from the public sector, it's going to come from the private sector.
Got you. Demi, parting shots?
I think that there's still a foundational thread across ESOs, angel investors, that still needs to be tackled, and I think that a lot of that sort of goes to education. Training for angel investors across different markets has significantly boosted entrepreneurship in those markets. I was speaking to some of the guys from Tanzania, and they were just sort of raving about how Tanzania, the startup ecosystem there, has grown, over the last couple of years. And that's just because the angel investment activity and just sort of recognizing what entrepreneurs are doing locally has been highlighted. I think also, like, who's working with, ESOs to put them through all of the hurdles or to help them solve some of the hurdles that they're going through. And so I think that that's one area. In addition to sort of working with entrepreneurs and supporting them with resources, I do think that there's a lot more effort needs to go into supporting ESOs, angel investment communities, and everyone who is honestly trying to help entrepreneurs build global scalable businesses.
Awesome.